what a wild night in the Stanley Cup playoffs last night. Close, you catch any of that?
I catched a little bit of it, man. I'm flipping between.
I mean, 4 overtime games.
I know. So I wasn't realizing until I'm flipping back between the Cavs game and a few of these games, and I'm just like, all right, forget this Cavs game. All right, I can't watch this anymore. Flipping it over. I mean, I'm not big into the NHL in the regular season, but right now, man, it's just intriguing. It just grabs you to want to watch, and it's just so quick.
Yep.
You know, keeps you interested. I'm becoming an NHL fan all over again now watching these playoffs.
It's the best postseason in sports. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I'm not bringing the NCAA tournament in the conversation here. In pro sports, it's the best postseason we have. And boy, do the Rangers need a win tonight. But more importantly, tonight, there is a great thing happening in Glens Falls. And our buddy Dave Strader, who is a Glens Falls native, will be dropping the puck before Game 3 of the Adirondack Thunder's series in the Kelly Cup playoffs. And on top of that, Dave has been honored with an award putting him into the Hockey Hall of Fame. And the NHL play-by-play man joins us here on Big Board Sports Now. Chris Honorato and Brian Mariano in for Roger all week long. Dave, first off, good morning. I know I said this in an email to you yesterday, but it has been great to hear your voice on games, and it'll be great to speak with you here this morning. How are you?
I'm doing well, guys, and couldn't agree more with what Brian said about, kind of, if you're not an everyday or all-season hockey fan, when you start to connect with the Stanley Cup playoffs and see what these athletes do and what they're willing to go through and how they're willing to pay such a price in order to stay in a game and try to win this trophy, it is intriguing. It is compelling television. It's every sport. I think you can talk about how much better the playoffs are than the regular season, but there's something about the Stanley Cup playoffs compared to what we see all season long that just it's phenomenal. And all 4 games going to overtime. I think it's only the 3rd time in the history of the Stanley Cup playoffs it's happened, and the first time in something like 30 years. And it's just riveting. I mean, you're flipping back and forth. I'm using that previous channel button. I'm wearing that thing out. I've got it on my iPad. I've got 2 games on the TV. I mean, it's crazy.
Dave, your career has taken you to all parts of this country and the world, in fact, with the Olympics. From your Adirondack Red Wings days to going to Detroit, I know Phoenix, Dallas, and then every part in between with NBC and ESPN, ABC. But now your career will take you to Toronto. Can you just give us some perspective on what it is like knowing you will be in the Hockey Hall of Fame?
Well, it still hasn't really sunk in. As I've sat here this morning and during the evening and just kind of looked over the list of names which I was familiar with. They've been giving this award out since 1984, and of course, it's named after Foster Hewitt, who's like the Vin Scully. He's the original voice of hockey going back to the middle of the 1900s and Hockey Night in Canada's early years, and given credit for kind of coming up with the lexicon of he shoots, he scores, and, a real pioneer. And, the first year they had the award named after him, he went in, the great Danny Gallivan, Fred Cusick, the longtime voice of the Boston Bruins, René Lecavalier, who was one of the iconic French-speaking play-by-play guys. And the list is just like a who's who of who's ever broadcast a sport. And for me, coming from Glens Falls and growing up, my broadcast heroes were Marv Albert calling the New York Knicks. I listened to Andy Musser call the Philadelphia 76ers back in the mid to late 60s. I was a basketball guy. And when I went to UMass Amherst to broadcast, I wanted to call college basketball games at Madison Square Garden and Boston Garden and the Palestra and all those places, and I did. And when I got out of UMass, it was like, okay, I'm going to be a basketball announcer somewhere. And then this arena comes to Glens Falls, and, even when the arena was in its formative stages, we thought it's going to be a minor pro basketball team or a minor hockey team. Of course, it turned out to be a hockey team, and I was hired initially as the assistant PR guy in late 1978, so I had never seen a hockey game live when I was hired. I had never been to a hockey game. I had seen it on TV, and so when they flew us out to Detroit to meet the Red Wing, Bruce Norris, they owned the team then. This was a few years before the Ilitches bought the team. And the Red Wings were out of town. It was between Christmas and New Year's. They brought us to the old Olympia Stadium. We sat in Mr. Norris's private box in the Great Lakes Invitational College Hockey Tournament, which has been going on that long and still does to this day, and usually features 4 schools from Michigan. So that was my introduction. And, a packed house at Olympia, the 4 Michigan schools competing, the bands, the atmosphere in the building, and I'm watching these guys play this game, and I'm like, wow, this is unbelievable. And so, came back to Glens Falls, and we did all the things we had to do to get ready to get a new franchise up and running. And we got into the summer, and Ned Harkness, who was running the team and the arena and was the liaison with Detroit, was putting together, obviously one of the small stations in Glens Falls would cover the games. But Ned, one of the reasons he wanted to call it the Adirondack Red Wings and not the Glens Falls Red Wings, and he met some, opposition with that, but it turned out obviously to be the right thing. He wanted regional support, he wanted a regional name, and he wanted a flagship radio station in Albany, so it was WROW. And so I'm hearing this stuff going on, and I said, well, who's going to call the games? And Ned knew of my broadcasting background. He said, have you ever done hockey? I said, no, but I'd like to learn. And so I basically took a tape recorder to the stands or press box during training camp in 1979, and there were 80 guys there. They fought every other shift back in those days. So there were brawls all the time. There was, there weren't guys that there weren't like 80 guys that all had different numbers. They were wearing like, different colored pennies just to separate who's on which team per scrimmages. So it wasn't the easiest thing to go up and try to, identify names and numbers. But I wanted to try to just get the pacing of the game, the lingo. And I had to start listening to guys. I mean, I listened to basketball guys all the time. I hadn't listened to much hockey. I mean, I didn't know who Foster Hewitt was or Danny Gallivan. But I started listening to Dan Kelly, who was kind of one of the first, great voices when the games were on national TV in the States, and listened to the Red Wing games on WJR radio at night. We could pick them up with that 50,000 clear watt signal that they had. And so I listened to Bruce Martin, and so that's kind of how I learned the thing. But I was immediately, as an announcer, Chris, I was immediately taken by how different the play-by-play craft was for hockey, really, than any other sport, because you really do have to kind of follow the puck, especially on radio, obviously, and it's more of a real descriptive thing rather than kind of a slower pace that you have with the other sports. So it was a challenge, but it was also exciting.
Dave Strader, NHL play-by-play man with us here. And Dave, I've tried to do hockey. I cannot do it. I have great respect for those who can. It is the most difficult sport, in my opinion, in which to do play-by-play.
Yeah. Well, and I understand that, and I think there is a certain kind of, I don't know what it is, kind of that short-term memory or kind of the instant connection between name and number, and once you do it, your brain kind of follows along, and if you kind of have that, great. If you don't, and you have to try to learn it, it can be tough. I watch and listen to other sports, and I marvel at the baseball guys. I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they do it for 4 hours with all the stuff and maybe it might be 5 hours, but all the stuff, the background, the history, the tradition, and to keep it interesting. I love being in the car sometimes. I'm not a huge baseball guy, but I love the art of listening to baseball on the radio. And I was so fortunate with the years I was in Detroit, I listened to Ernie Harwell, who just had one of the all-time voices of all time and one of the great storytellers and, a Hall of Famer and all that. And so I got to hear him. And, it's just every sport has its challenge. But you're right. I think for a lot of guys that do play-by-play that, that try hockey and realize how different it is, it can be a challenge that way.
Dave, you had local connections here, obviously, in Glens Falls, and we've had teams go through Glens Falls and Albany, but now with the Albany having the River Rats, now the Devils, and the Devils are leaving after their playoff run this year, why do you think that Albany's had such a tough time sustaining, a hockey team, whether it be AHL or ECHL?
That's a great question, because it really, if you go back to when, the Adirondack team came and kind of grabbed the market, and there wasn't hockey in Albany. And, at some point after the Red Wings had been so successful, I forget the exact order of things, what happened, but there was an agreement to kind of give up that territorial right so that a team could come into Albany. And maybe that was kind of the beginning of the downfall for the Adirondack team, because having the market to themselves, being up here, it wasn't just the fans that came from the Capital District. And we did have a number that stayed, with the team, season ticket holders for a long period of time. But, eventually we were primarily Saratoga, Clifton Park, and North. It wasn't just the people coming up to the games. It was just having the attention of the media there, whether it was, Channel 13 sending camera crews and when there was news of what was going on in the world of hockey, it was the Adirondack Red Wings. Well, now you're trying to share that with another team that comes in. But why it specifically didn't work in Albany, I'm not sure. Whether the building was never quite right, it was too big. At one point, I think they had the team in Albany, and there was a team in Troy that the Islanders had, or maybe when the Islanders had their team in Troy, there wasn't a team in Albany. But it's kind of baffling to me that it hasn't worked at a greater level. And it's too bad they're leaving, I guess, heading over to Binghamton. But we'll see what that means and what impact it has on the Thunder now with the ECHL franchise staying here and the coalition of businessmen that have bought the Civic Center from the city and now purchased the rights to the franchise to ensure that minor pro hockey stays here. It'll be interesting to see what they do with an affiliation. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you ended up having a team like the Devils say, okay, we've got our team in New Jersey, now we've got our American League team in Binghamton. Boy, we can have our ECHL team in Glens Falls, and now because there's more and more guys moving between this ECHL and the AHL. There's more and more guys that have, an NHL affiliated contract, either a second or third goaltender in the organization. You got a lot of these young college free agents that are signing contracts that are starting out at the ECHL. You could have the Rangers with Glens Falls, Hartford in New York. You could have Montreal with their American League team up in the province of Quebec and their ECHL team here. There's a lot of possibilities, and I think if you have an affiliation with one of those teams in the Northeast, as far as the NHL, I think it'll help the market and kind of energize the fan base here.
Dave, I'm going to break almost one of the first rules of Sports Talk Radio and ask you a question here live on the. Can you stay through a break with us? I know we want to get your perspective on the playoffs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hang on one second. We've got more with NHL play-by-play man Dave Strader and Glens Falls native. We'll actually get to tonight's games and the larger picture of the Stanley Cup playoffs next on Big Board Sports 104.5 The Team.